So, good morning. Name is Lykke Friis. This is Aalborg, where I'm at the moment. This webinar is on Moldova, as you all know. I checked this morning. I am 1,800 kilometers from Moldova's capital, Chisinau. And as we all know, on the 20th of November, there was a referendum in Moldova, a razor-thin election result. We also know from the OSCE that there was widespread disinformation. There were also votes being bought, so it was a very dramatic referendum, and we're also seeing similar events taking place in Georgia. What is interesting now is that there will be the second round of the presidential elections on Sunday in Moldova. And although I guess we are all focusing upon the US election, we should not forget elections in our own region. And that is also why we're doing this webinar. What can happen in Moldova? What kind of impact will this have upon the situation in Moldova? And what about the consequences for the EU as such? And how do you actually conduct sort of an election campaign in such a climate with hybrid threats such as disinformation? These are some of the issues that we will now discuss. And we have the great honor of the former Prime Minister of Moldova joining us today, live from Berlin, as far as I know. And just to set the record straight, Natalia, which party did you sort of represent when you were Prime Minister? And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and to spread the word about what is happening in Moldova. I do agree with you that it is very important to continue to have a focus on what is going on in our region. I currently am out of politics as I am on the oversight board of the National Bank of Moldova. I also founded and lead a think tank called Partnerships for New Economy in Moldova that is focused on accelerating our EU integration. And I am also a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow in Berlin. But when I was in office, when I was Prime Minister, I represented the Party of Action and Solidarity, which endorsed in this campaign current President Maia Sandu for the elections.
And let's just go back. Let's start there to the referendum. What were you actually voting on?
So the referendum asked people whether they agree to change the constitution. And there is a draft law that was voted by Parliament and endorsed by the Constitutional Court, which basically said, we will change the preamble of the Constitution and include sort of European integration as an overall objective and reconfirm the identity of the Moldovans as European. There is also a new article in the Constitution that gives the Parliament the right to vote on any agreements with the European Union and stipulates that these agreements will be more important than the national law. So in fact, even though we have a razor-thin majority, so 50.38% of the people, a difference of only 10,000 votes, decided that, yes, the Constitution should be changed to this precise effect, which means if the Constitutional Court validates the results tomorrow, then they publish the changed Constitution and it has very clear legal consequences.
So that also means if the voters had said no in this particular referendum, I mean, what would then have happened actually?
If voters had said no, then there would be a need for another referendum later on. So it wouldn't have had legal consequences on the current process of European integration. So it would just mean that another referendum would have been necessary before the or after the end of negotiations. Of course, it has all kinds of political and social consequences, but not legal constitutional consequences.
And why was the referendum actually held? Because there was no need to have it at the present stage, I presume, because not to sound too pessimistic, you're not going to join within the next couple of years now, to put it, I mean, maybe even more optimistic than pessimistic.
Well, this is a question that is better posed to those who organized the referendum. But President Sandu said, look, we have this historical context where it is important for Moldovans to say once and for all, that we do not want to be in this gray zone.
You were just talking about why the referendum was called, and as you also rightly pointed out, that we would have to ask sort of those who actually made the decision. But we have had some debate, one will have to say, about why it was necessary to hold the referendum at the same time as the presidential election. So, what has the debate been in Moldova about the decision?
So, I'm not sure when I was dropped out of the discussion, but I was saying that President Sandu said, there is this context, this historic opportunity to say Moldova wants to be anchored in the free world. It doesn't want to be part of this gray zone. And we want to have very clear sort of objectives set out in our constitution, which then has legal consequences on the actions of the political parties and any government that may come. So, for example, theoretically speaking, because this constitutional amendments will come into force, if Parliament, for some reason, this or another composition of the Parliament, votes a law like of the type that was voted in Georgia on foreign agents, then theoretically, because of these provisions in the Constitution, it can be attacked in the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court can say, well, actually, this contravenes to all European norms, and this cannot have legal effect in the country. So, of course, it's more complicated than that, right? And this razor-thin majority creates some questions of, will somebody want to hold another referendum and, pose a different question and, play on the legitimacy of the referendum. Here, we have heard already former President Dodon say that, he thinks another referendum should be held. The law says that it can only happen after 2 years, so it cannot be organized earlier. So yes, there will be discussions, and this is why the results of the presidential elections are quite consequential, and especially the results of the parliamentary elections next year.
Okay, but we know that there are already implications of this referendum, as you point out, which
Absolutely.
could then also, so it actually ring fences, you could say, your road towards EU membership, but also your choice to be part of the Western world, or whatever expression you want to use. I'm just going to say that all our participants can raise questions as we go along. So please use the chat function. Then I will look down and read your various questions. You said that the Constitutional Court would come out with a sort of response or verdict. When was that again? And what are people expecting with regards to that?
So tomorrow, the Constitutional Court will validate the results of the elections, of the referendum, sorry, and the first round of presidential elections. So this is a process that is normal and happens after each elections. So the Central Electoral Commission sends the results to the Constitutional Court, and then the Constitutional Court basically validates the results, and then they become final.
Okay, so that's a normal procedure.
Yes.
Let's turn to the sort of overall problem of running an election campaign in a climate with hyper threats. Could you just give us an example of what actually happened during the referendum campaign?
So this is actually a very important question for democracies to think about. You know, how can we counter and increase the resilience to foreign interference when foreign powers, like the Russian Federation in our case, are finding new and new ways of undermining our democracies? So we have seen this happen through disinformation, propaganda, the cyber attacks, weaponization of energy supply, and so on. And what we see now in Moldova is an outright buying of votes. So after the first round of the elections, we had the police come out and declare that approximately 138,000 unique numbers have received, unique phone numbers have received money through this Russian system of Promsvязь Bank, which is under international sanctions. So, basically we have documents and sort of documentation to show that 140,000 people have been involved in this large network of paying for somebody's votes. And there are so we had independent journalistic investigations in Moldova. So Ziarul de Gardă, investigative journalism newspaper, has actually infiltrated their journalists in these networks and have shown videos and recordings of how these networks operate and how money is paid in order for people to vote one way or another. We also had, during the day of the elections, a BBC reporter who was just observing the elections, actually managed to film the conversation with a woman who voted and was looking for the person who was supposed to deliver the money. So it's local journalists, international journalists, and also law enforcement agencies in Moldova that are saying that, you know, we have definitive evidence of foreign interference in the elections, which are of a nature, an order of magnitude that can change the result. And we come under a very interesting situation because, you know, when we talked about free and fair elections, we always meant, you know, is Moldova organizing free and fair elections? You know, and from this point of view, we can say that, you know, Moldovan institutions sort of did everything to organize free and fair elections, but then you have this foreign interference. And I'm not sure that we have been in a situation to say, well, can we consider these elections free and fair if there has been foreign interference? So it's a very pertinent and interesting question. And why should people in Europe care? Because we have seen how Moldova has always been a laboratory for these methods. You know, actually before the discussions of foreign interference in European or US elections from the Russian Federation, this had happened in Moldova before. You know, some of these elements of how disinformation is spread, we now are seeing after they have been tested in our region, we see how they are being propagated in European countries and in Western liberal democracies. So this is not somewhere far away. This is not something that doesn't matter for Europe. In fact, this matters for defending democracies, and this matters because this means that you can influence, for example, what is going on in Ukraine, not just through military means, but through these hybrid war elements. So this is something to really disentangle and study and see, because this is important for Moldova, this is important for Ukraine, but this is also important for improving the resilience of European and global democracies.
And how can you respond then? How do you sort of manage sort of to basically make sure that this doesn't play such a big role in now also in the presidential election, but also the parliamentary election that yes. You mentioned? And what can the European Union do there? Because as you indicate, this is actually a European problem. And if you are the testing ground for yes. These sort of new methods, or you could say they're maybe not that new, what can actually be done about that?
So here the strength of institutions really matter. So we saw the police come out, we saw the prosecutor general come out, but as you know, probably reforms of the justice sector began in Moldova, and they are very slow. So there is an external vetting of judges and prosecutors, and this process has started, and some key institutions like the Superior Council of Magistrates, for example, have been reformed, but the external vetting is still going on, and it is facing really profound resistance from within the system. And so what we're seeing is, well, imagine the police and the prosecution having to document 140,000 cases. And, this is actually quite a lot of work, especially for a small country with a small, in a sense, in absolute numbers, a small number of police and prosecutors. But we are seeing that, for example, judges are not acting on this evidence. And we are seeing that there are these constant delays in the courts. And in the meantime, while this very cumbersome process is going on, there are some consequences that may undermine the reform process itself. So one thing that we have to see is, well, what are the tools that we have to strengthen institutions and to reform some of these systems, especially in countries with weak institutions? Second, we really need to look profoundly at sort of this organized crime aspect of it, and to see, well, what is the money flow? What can we do, for example, to stop this smuggling of cash? Because we see, in Moldova, we had the police search people after a congress that was organized in Russia, and just from sort of this one plane of passengers, they confiscated more than $1 million. But how else are these money being cashed out? So I think it's really important to start looking at, what do we know about these money flows, and then, what can we do to stop them? And then, see if there are transnational aspects to it as well. So really, we have to double down on what European Union does best, and that is help reform institutions.
But I guess there is a vicious circle here, because in order to join the European Union, you need to have free and fair elections. And as you already pointed out, well, you can put a question mark, or maybe also a big question mark, behind whether these were fair and free elections. So this will be, at the end of the day, could be one of the challenges that you have for joining the European Union, right?
So in fact, if you look at sort of the intent of the European Union, right? Like it's for national institutions to organize free and fair elections. So in that sense, absolutely these were free and fair elections. And I expect the constitutional courts to rule tomorrow that these were free and fair elections. So, but these were elections that were marred by profound interference. So,
Exactly. Yeah.
if you look at the polls, Moldovans are European. So I say this, I cannot stress this enough. So a win is a win, and it has clear consequences in terms of sort of the legal impact, but also don't um, don't mix up the results of the referendum to change the constitution with the pro-European orientation of the populace of Moldova. So if we look, one of the shocks of this referendum was that the numbers that we saw were much lower than the polls, right? So if you look at the polls, then the European sentiment is closer to 60%. So in that regard, I think we have to sort of be very careful not to sort of put the label on Moldova, that it is not very clear on its European integration. One, we now have it in the constitution, and two, the European sentiment is bigger. It was just really dampened by this foreign interference. And
Well,
one more
yes.
thing that I would say
Yep.
is, in terms of legitimacy of power, any elections also mean that people are saying, what they think, how fast the reforms are going, how well is the government doing, and so on. Well, how are you supposed to disentangle that if you have something that really changes the extent of the results, and it prevents you from nuancing some of the internal legitimacy issues.
I have some questions coming in, and I'll take them in just 1 second after I ask my next question. And could you just explain to us, I mean, the very fact that when you are a citizen of Moldova, you are also a citizen of Romania, right? So you're already a EU Union citizen, and I guess that also means, I mean, that lots of people living outside Moldova, right, are able to vote. And how does that play out in the upcoming presidential election on Sunday?
So there are two issues here. One is this double citizenship issue, and one is Moldovans that are in the diaspora. Some of them are not in the diaspora with Romanian passports. They went with Moldovan passports and now have actually other European passports. But you are right. It is estimated that about 1 million Moldovans are abroad. And we are a country with one of the highest participation rates of diaspora or Moldovans living abroad in the elections. So this time we had 240,000 Moldovans who live mostly in the European Union, but not only, who have voted in the elections. This was 15% of the vote. These Moldovans actually vote in much larger numbers in favor of the European Union, because most of them are living in the European Union. So, in the diaspora, we have 77% of people who voted in favor of changing the constitution. And remember, this is also the diaspora that voted in Moscow, Israel, Turkey, or other places where the support in favor of the referendum may have been lower. So
That's a good prediction.
what we're seeing for the second round. So we're seeing the Moldovans living abroad as this big force, that is supporting Moldova's Western orientation, and we saw their impact during this referendum, and we are seeing a mobilization for the second round. The question is then, in the referendum, they outvoted the fraud.
Yeah.
So can we see an outvote of the fraud in the second round of presidential elections.
And that leads me directly to the question that was asked by Amalie Salomon, because that is, considering the gravity of Russian interference in the referendum and first round of elections, what are the implications for the second round of the presidential election?
So when we look at the results, Maya Sandu is in a clear lead, right? So she got 42.5% of the vote in the first round.
So the present president, yeah.
The current president, the incumbent president. And the second candidate who went into the second round got 26% of the vote. The third candidate had 14% of the vote. Now, one issue that President Sandu pointed out in one of the debates that was held after the first round is that actually, had it not been for the estimated voting, or the estimated vote buying, excuse me. So if these 150,000 people, or approximately, had not voted for Alexandru Stoyanoglu, the Socialist Party candidate, we may have seen a different round two. It could have been President Sandu versus Renato Usatăi, a populist candidate. So first, we have to really look into this and see, this could have changed the results. And second, so now that we have the second round between incumbent President Maya Sandu and Alexandru Stoyanoglu, the Socialist Party candidate, if everybody unites against the president, then actually it's really difficult for her to win. And again, if all these 150 or 200,000 votes that are estimated by law enforcement agencies and the sociologists to have been influenced by Russia, then this can really change the results of the elections. And it's not clear that the mobilization of the honest vote, as we call it, can actually overcome this fraud.
And opinion polls, I mean, what do we have sort of, obviously we have opinion polls, I'm not sure whether they can be trusted either, but how does it look like at the moment for the election on Sunday?
So we don't have opinion polls that have come out after the first round. I'm sure parties have their own internal polls, but I have not seen any public polling on this. But even mathematical calculation, if we look at the results of the first round and we look at absolute votes, we can see that President Maya Sandu has to mobilize around 200,000 additional votes in her favor in order to win.
Okay, and are you still there?
Yes.
Yes, you are. Just I can see you, but I was going to see whether you are frozen again. Thank God you are not.
We'll try to move more.
Yeah, okay. You don't have to. And who is the sort of the candidate of the opposition? I can just say a few words about him.
So the candidate of the opposition is Alexandru Stoyanoglu, and he is a former prosecutor general. And he's a former prosecutor in the Gagauz autonomy. So he comes from the Gagauz autonomy. He is somebody who is not very well known in terms of his policies. So he was a prosecutor general, but I think one of the issues is, who is his team, who is behind him. And if this whole illegal vote buying machine has been put to serve his win, then what will his decisions be? What we know is that he has been very formalistic, if you wish, in interpreting the law as a prosecutor, and because of that, during his time as a prosecutor, we saw some of the beneficiaries of the banking fraud, which happened in Moldova in 2014 and created a huge impact because 12% of GDP have been siphoned off through state-owned banks. And this has been a very significant issue in Moldova. So some of these people have been released, especially Vyacheslav Platon, one of the ultimate beneficiaries mentioned in the Kroll report on the banking fraud.
And would it be safe to say that he's betting on two horses, that he's both pro-EU and pro-Russian?
So what we saw in the public space, and then especially in the debates after the first round, because there has been one debate between Maya Sandu and Alexander Stoyanoglu, is that, yes, he's saying, I am pro-European, but not now. I am, I support relationships with our neighbors, but also with Russia, so he's not clarifying some of these contradictions that the current context are creating. He is also a Romanian citizen. His family, from what I understand, lives in Europe. So this is again, the issue is not necessarily who he is, but who is behind him and what type of decisions will he make. And the Maya Sandu during the debates called him a Trojan horse. So somebody who says, they are in favor of European Union and the European values. So he talked, for example, about the European values in terms of minority languages or treating how you treat ethnic minorities. But at the same time, again, it's not clear how he intends to sort of juggle this this public face that he's in favor of the European Union, but then decisions to live in harmony with everybody, including Russia, even though we have a war. So the question is, will we then now go to buy gas from Gazprom? Will there be other decisions that will in effect reduce some of the progresses that have been made in the last several years? And very, very importantly, if he wins, then what happens for the parliamentary elections?
In 25.
In 25, yes.
Yeah, we have an excellent question here from Jacob Lolk. What are the most important things that the EU could or should do to support strengthen resilience in Moldova against hybrid threats? Does the EU, is the EU doing enough, or should the EU do more?
An excellent question, and it's a very complex.
So was the first question, we have to say.
This is a very complex issue, and some of these solutions are not simple. So the EU has been supporting Moldova through this external assistance. So we see budget support. We saw Ursula von der Leyen visit Moldova and
the Nordic foreign ministers
the growth plan and the 1.8 billion euros that could be accessed by Moldova under the growth plan. There is support for combating disinformation, support for civil society to strengthen the resilience of the society, support for reforming institutions and so on. But ultimately, I think some of these issues do not get through to the people in terms of linking this. In a sense, it's not about buying sort of the support, right? So it's about communicating to people. So I think we could have a lot more people-to-people contacts, for example. So we saw this macro support but actually there has not been enough scaling up of these exchanges, for example, between mayors on very concrete topics like how have you used access to European funds to improve uh, the standards of living in your community. I saw that picking up in the last year or two, but I would say this is not sufficient. There is a lot more to be done in terms of content, like what does it mean to negotiate European integration? How can we avoid some of the issues that other countries have raised, like how do we ensure that we don't become a dependent economy? How do we increase state capability to negotiate some of the issues that are important for Moldovans? And also, as I mentioned, I think it's very important to do what European Union does best and insist on issues around rule of law, around combating organized crime and corruption, and really sort of provide this sort of accountability. Well, first information exchange and flow, and then accountability. So in a sense, we just have to live our values in our everyday exchanges as much as possible.
Thank you. And which role has the war in Ukraine played, both in a referendum campaign and now also in the presidential campaign?
Well, I don't think this can be underestimated. It has all kinds of consequences on the Moldovan society. So, for example, part of this vote, it might be a protest vote. Again, I think it's a very difficult to disentangle um, the vote buying versus sort of this protest vote. But remember, Moldovans have gone through a difficult situation in the last 4 years. It's not at all like, I don't want to compare to what the Ukrainians have gone through, because they have full-scale military activities and people are sacrificing their lives every day, and we are very grateful. At the same time, in Moldova, although you don't have military activities, but you have had severe economic consequences of the war. We had stagflation, quite a profound stagflation. So inflation reached 35% in 2022, and there was a decrease of 6% in the economy, which still hasn't been recuperated. So if you look at sort of real wages and real economic conditions, then people are worse off. Then you have this major insecurity in our region. So it makes people uncomfortable. It makes people anxious, which of course then again makes people more vulnerable to these hybrid war elements. And some of them may say, oh, we don't want to be provoked by Russia. So even though we are in favor of European Union, or we want to move closer to the European Union, we actually don't want war, so we don't want to provoke Russia. So maybe we can go slower. So we can actually not, implement these sort of reforms at the speed that they have been implemented. So again, this is a very subtle sort of, this is how then propaganda becomes more detrimental. It strips countries of their agencies. It sort of puts the fear in the people that changes the way that they think. So, and then I can go on and on. We have 80,000 Ukrainian refugees who are still living in Moldova, and we have had, as in many European countries, impact on real estate prices and availability and so on. So there are many consequences that are complex and play out in different ways. And as I said, I think it actually makes people more vulnerable to this disinformation and to these hybrid war techniques.
I'm 100% agree with that. What about the energy situation? Because you are obviously very dependent upon energy from Russia, I presume, during the before the war, but you've
Yes.
managed to more or less become independent, right?
Yes. So if we
Unlike the
exclude
EU.
if we exclude the Transnistrian region,
Yeah.
then Moldova, so the gas used in right bank Moldova, which is under the control of the Moldovan authorities, we diversified from 100% dependency on Russian gas supplied by Gazprom. In 1 year, we have diversified away and started buying from alternative sources. So of course, this meant many outstanding things that I think a lot of people didn't think Moldova was capable of. For example, we were the first country to use the new Greece-Bulgaria interconnector. We were the first country to use the Trans-Balkan pipeline in reverse. We put in a new pipeline with Romania, and we accessed the market for the very first time. But that meant that prices went up 7 times for a Moldovan household. And yes, with the support of the European Union, we were able to put in a targeted compensation system, which compensated most of this growth. But still, this was for an average household, the prices in reality that they paid went up 3 times. So this was very impactful. And so the question now is quite complex. What will happen now because there is this constant pressure, right? That we can you buy it cheaper? Is it better for the people if you buy cheaper gas from Russia? Of course, we have now the complication: where will this transit through? So I don't think it's that easy to go back, but still, because Moldova has achieved so much and has shown that in a short amount of time you can completely diversify, I think in a short amount of time you can actually go back. So we have to be very careful in terms of what is happening in the energy sector.
And that obviously also is background, or if you could say, of this election, and something that feeds into the overall campaign, I presume, and also makes it easier for pro-Russian forces then to use these hybrid threats and then try to impact election. I'm sure also, as you mentioned, the inflation going up that much, although it has now come under control, I guess one could say.
Yes, so the inflation has now gone back into the sort of targeted band of the national bank. So it has been put under control, but still, we saw this large impact on people's real incomes.
Yeah, and everyday life. What about the turnout rate for the presidential election? Do you have low turnout rates usually? I guess there was lots of debate, or there was lots of debate about the turnout rate for the referendum, where you needed was it 33% of people voting in order for the vote to be valid. So what are you expecting now for the presidential election?
So we actually saw quite a high participation rate, especially considering that actually our electoral lists are quite large and not necessarily reflect sort of the latest population number, and that's because of very high migration and multiple issues, including connected to the census and so on. But we had more than 51% participation rate in the presidential elections, and 50.7, I think it was 51.75 for presidential elections, and then 50.72 for the referendum. So actually the referendum,
pretty high,
yeah, the referendum had a very high participation rate, and I would say, it a lot of so there were some concerns about participation rate ahead of the referendum. Well, it turns out the concern should have been more towards the yes vote. interestingly, on this topic, the Russian Federation changed its strategy halfway through the campaign. First, the sort of parties that are influenced by the Russian Federation were saying boycott the referendum.
Yep.
And then they started calling for participation, but a no vote. And there was still, some tens of thousands, actually. I think the latest number is like 32,000 people that boycotted the referendum or didn't participate in the referendum. So you see the participation rate in the presidential elections is a bit higher than in the referendum. So it's really difficult to tell whether this flip-flopping ultimately led to the referendum passing.
We are almost coming to an end, but let's just sort of focus on the actual sort of implication of this election on Sunday. Could one say that you are actually voting on whether Moldova will leave the gray zone, that Moldova will clearly then put itself on track towards membership, towards the European, Western sort of world, whatever expression you like to use, or whether Moldova will more turn towards Russia? Can one make that argument, or what is actually at stake?
I think one could make this argument, absolutely, because we, as I explained to you in the beginning of our discussion, we have clear legal consequences in the Constitution, but then, how will this be implemented? What will be the sort of legitimacy of institutions that will be applying this? And then how will a win by this opposition candidate, Alexandru Stoianoglu, influence the results of the parliamentary elections, which will have clear consequences for our European integration path? So I do believe that this is, again, a choice between sort of a clear pro-European path and sort of this gray zone at best, but considering the context, it could be much worse. It's not just Moldova going back to this, not knowing. It could be that Russia will be much more aggressive because of its need to encircle Ukraine. So I do believe that the second round is of very, very important, massive consequences, and any sort of discussion about the extent of the fraud, what the institutions have done, what can be done better in justice reform and so on, have to be left after the 3rd of November.
And that completely confirms why it was important that we have had this discussion. It also confirms why it was important that our audience listen to us. And it also confirms that although we will all be watching who wins in the United States of America, Harris or Trump, we should also on Sunday make sure that we focus upon what happens in Moldova. So thank you very much for spending this almost an hour with us from Berlin. And we will definitely sort of look out for who's going to win on Sunday. But I think you also clarified to us that we should also remember to follow the parliamentary election, although they will take place not this year, but next year. So thank you so much for joining us. And this obviously also goes for our audience. So
thank you.
Goodbye and farewell here from Aalborg to Berlin.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.